guest this evening is Professor Richard Popkin. I know him as Dick now that I'm older. In our department, there's quite an organic relationship with Professor Popkin. Mr. Kottman in our staff worked under Professor Popkin at the University of California at San Diego for his PhD. I worked with Professor Popkin while a graduate student at Iowa City, and he left then and went to the West Coast. And we have a lot of good memories. I have a chance to get him for some of the things he did when I was a graduate student, but I can't take the time to do it now. But I remember the work very well. Professor Popkin is undoubtedly one of the world's outstanding historians of philosophy, though he, out of a sense of modesty, wouldn't acknowledge that. His work is undoubtedly of the highest quality in the area of histophilosophy, especially within a certain period. One of his books, The History of Skepticism from Erasmus to Descartes, is in fact a key, prominent study in the history of skepticism, and he's presently at work expanding his study of skepticism beyond the period of Descartes. Some of you may know that Professor Popkin has also written a book entitled The Second Oswald. During the period immediately following the Kennedy assassination, and while the Warren Report was in process of being drawn up, this book received a great deal of attention, and it's one of the most minute and careful studies written by a person not associated directly with the assassination. And it's also a very highly regarded publication. In addition, of course, Professor Popkin has done a great deal of publishing in professional journals of all varieties. He has been on the staff at the University of Iowa. He's been on the staff at the University of California at San Diego. He presently is still there technically, though he's currently in St. Louis at Washington University as a visiting professor. He will return to St. Louis next September as a permanent member of that faculty, where he'll be professor of philosophy and Jewish studies. Last year he was at City University of New York as a distinguished visiting professor. He has a number of other honors and awards, too numerous, in fact, to mention here. Let me say personally, it's a great delight to have this man come to us. He's one of those professors one remembers not only for what he taught, but also for who he was and who he is. And it's in that vein that I present him to you with a great deal of delight.
Thank you very much, and after that introduction, I can't live up to it, so I suppose I should close the discussion right now. But I'd like to talk to you tonight about some material I've been working on for the last couple of years on the philosophical basis of modern racism. In the last decade, there's been a great deal of interest, especially among historians of anthropology, historians of American history, and related subjects, as to where current racism comes from. The present interest is quite different than a previous concern in the period of about 1935 to 1950, when many scholars in the history of anthropology, political history, and so on, were concerned about finding the roots of Nazi racism. There's been a growing realization in the last decade or so that racism isn't just what developed in Germany, but it is a basic feature of Western ideology. What I and others have been concerned to look into is when this gets to be the case and why, and if we can find out how it all happened, maybe we can also figure out some sort of solution that's going to overcome our racist heritage. In the works that have come out on the subject in the last decade, various general theories are offered, which I'd like to dispense with first before offering my own, as to what accounts for racism being such a pervasive force in the Western world. One general thesis is that it represents the basic hostility of one group to another. This is going on all the time, and what we have in the West is merely one more case of what you can find anywhere, anytime in the world. Another theory dealing more directly with the situation in the Western world is to trace back natural antipathy, which one finds expressed over and over again, of lighter-skinned people to darker-skinned people. Third view, and both of these, I think, are dealing with factors that one has to take account of and are part of the explanation, but still don't account for why the Western world has gotten so involved with its particular form of racist theories. Thirdly, an attempt to find beginning to all this, one of the views that's current is to attribute all things good and bad to the Jews, including racism, and to trace it back to the Bible, and to claim that the Bible itself and its chosen people theory and the Jewish view towards Gentiles states a basic form of racism that's just gone on. And then there's a more erudite version of this, claiming it's not the Bible but the Talmud, and finding a text in the Talmud which actually gets used by American Puritan preachers as a justification for their racism, and claiming that it comes from this. There's also a contention that it's both biblical and Greek, and the Greek view that non-Greeks are barbarians is one of the roots of racism. Well, all of these theories allow for the group that's being discriminated against to improve or overcome their situation by some sort of process. By conversion, in the case of biblical racism, that anybody who's a Gentile could always become a Jew. If he became a Jew, then no longer falls in the discriminated group. In the Greek world, a barbarian could always become a Greek if he moved to Athens, learned decent Greek, and started writing in Greek. And some of the major figures in Greek civilization, like Aristotle, would rank as barbarians in the original meaning of the term, but become major Greek scholars, contributors to Greek culture by assimilation, by overcoming the difference between them and the privileged group. In the ancient world, especially in the Roman world, there is nothing one could call racism in the present meaning of the term, except with regard to Jews and Christians. The Roman Empire is neutral about almost any other group, and in fact, in some of the present research, there's arguments about whether various figures in the Roman world were white or black, and you can't tell since it's not one of the terms that gets brought up, it's not one of the descriptions that's given. The racism against Jews and Christians is principally against their practices and the fact they don't fit in to the Roman political world. In the ancient world, one finds a minimal interest about why people are different colors, why people differ in other characteristics. They knew about the black world in Ethiopia, in Egypt, and so on. And one finds they take the matter quite calmly and offer what was considered the best explanation up to the 18th century, the climate theory. The people who live in hotter climates get darker, people who live in cooler climates are lighter. But there's no sign in the discussions of this, which usually are a sentence, a paragraph or so, in authors like Polybius, that it's any big issue with them. The same is true in the Middle Ages. One finds occasional discussions about why people are different. There's a controversy over why God created pygmies, what purpose they could serve, but nobody's particularly excited about the pygmy question, and nobody's world hinges on discriminating against pygmies. What's offered as the major case of medieval racism is the Jewish philosopher Yehuda Halevi, who who makes some fairly strong and nasty racist remarks about non-Jews, but his work from which all this is taken, his book called The Kuzari, is a work to convert the pagans and the Christians. The whole purpose of it is to prove that everybody should become Jewish and that they would all become equal or almost equal. As people who write on Yehuda Halevi point out, he claims the converts can't become completely equal until 10 generations after they're converted. But at least 10 generations does the job, and then everybody's equal. In modern racism, I think the crucial distinction between that and any form of discriminatory practice prior to then is that you can't get out of your discriminated group. Well, when does this start? The term race, as far as we know up to now, first appears in late medieval Germany, meaning lineage, and principally Jewish lineage, and then gets taken over in Spain, again meaning lineage. The first time one finds what I think one could call modern racism is in Spain and Portugal in the 15th and 16th century, in which, because of an amazing situation that develops there, they present a theory of racial difference based on biological lineage, and then shortly after starting the theory, they discover America, introduce the theory in America to deal with the problem of the Indians, and then embellish the theory as they start enslaving the Africans to deal with the African case. In Spain, starting in 1391, a massive effort is made to convert the Jews of Spain to Christianity. And for the first time in Christian history, it actually works. Nobody's quite sure how large a group they converted. Estimates run around somewhere between a quarter, a half, and maybe up to 90% of the Jews of Spain are forcibly converted to Christianity. After the conversion occurs, the Spaniards find a new situation they never dreamed would happen. Spanish anti-Semitism, up to the time of the forced conversions, prevented the Jews from holding any jobs in the church. The Jews were the bankers, the cabinet officers, the lawyers, the doctors, but they weren't the churchmen. After the forced conversion, they become the bishops, the theologians, the college professors, and the group that's called the New Christians, the converts, become the dominant force in the Spanish scene by the middle of the 15th century. As this starts happening, and the sort of thing that happens is the Rabbi of Burgos, Solomon Halevi, converts, changes his name to Pablo de Santa Maria, becomes the Bishop of Burgos, becomes one of Spain's greatest theologians, passes on the bishopric to his son, Alonso de Cartagena, who is also one of Spain's greatest Catholic theologians. And the old Christians, the non-converts, start objecting to the state of affairs where the new Christians are taking over the society and start insisting on a racial distinction between the old Christians and the new Christians. The racial distinction gets defined in law, first in Seville and Toledo in the middle of the 15th century, that anybody who had a Jewish ancestor in the last 5 generations is Jewish, no matter what he's converted to, no matter how Christian he's become, no matter what he believes. Legally, he's Jewish and is forbidden to hold all sorts of jobs in the church and state. Spanish racial laws make the situation practically irremediable, since if you had a Jewish ancestor 5 generations back, you're Jewish, and then 5 generations after you, since you're Jewish, your descendant is Jewish, the thing can go on and on forever. The Portuguese, taking this over, had categories up to the 18th century of people who were Jewish, who were half Jewish, a quarter Jewish, an eighth Jewish, a 16th Jewish, a 32nd Jewish, and then a general category, part Jewish. This led in Spain to people who wanted to go to college, join a religious order, hold a government job, having to get a certificate of purity of blood, limpieza de sangre, in which you trace back your ancestors for 5 generations and showed that you didn't have any Jewish or Moorish ancestor. As one can suspect, this led to tremendous forgery of documents. Somebody's made a study of these documents and found a case, which I suppose must have happened over and over again since the Inquisition was constantly finding secret Jews as bishops, as professors, and so on. They found a case where a young man wanted to be an army captain, and he writes to his uncle, who's a bishop, and says, "How do I fill out the certificate of purity of blood?" And his uncle tells him, "Young man, it's the most important day of your life. You now have to decide who your ancestors were." And then outlines for him how you do it. You find a town that's been completely destroyed by a war, has no records left, and then you construct your genealogy. If this is what was going on, this accounts for why the Inquisition, even with all these racial laws, was constantly finding that the new Christians were running the country, no matter how many of them they stamped out, burned up, exported to other countries. With this sort of theory of a racial characteristic that defines a group as inferior and puts them in a category in which they can never get out of their inferiority, the Spaniards have either the good or bad fortune to find America and immediately start using the theory in America. One of the first problems faced after Columbus arrived was, who did they discover? Who were these people? And part of the problem is how they fit them into the world of Spanish Catholicism. Are these people from the biblical world or not? And all sorts of theories get generated over the 2 centuries after Columbus's arrival, that the Indians are lost tribes of Israel, they're Arabs, they're Phoenicians, they're Asians, they're Norwegians, and most dangerous theory of all, which I'll deal with at length in the course of this paper, that they don't come from the biblical world at all, that they're pre-Adamites, that they're not descendants of Adam, but descendants of people who predate Adam, have nothing to do with the biblical world. From the original reports of the explorers and the conquistadores, 2 major theories are being offered. One, the Indians are subhuman. The other, the Indians are better than everybody else. They're noble savages. The people who are trying to prove they're subhuman are trying to prove that the Indians are incapable of having any abstract ideas, incapable of running their own world, incapable of Christianity, incapable of morality, and therefore the Spaniards should take over their life and run the whole Indian universe. The conquistadores start doing this almost from the day they arrive, and in 1512 a great debate begins, what's called the struggle for justice among the Indians, or a book's been written on it called Aristotle in the Indies, when a preacher named Montesinus gets up and delivers a sermon in Santo Domingo claiming, "I am the voice crying in the wilderness." One can't treat the Indians this way, they're human beings, and goes on developing his theory that the Indians are entitled to the same rights as everybody else. The conquistadores are shocked by Montesinos' preaching, demand that he be removed. They make an apology. Next week he gives his apology, a much stronger statement of the case, and starts the great debate over whether the Indians are really human or aren't. Bartolome de las Casas, the Bishop of Guatemala, becomes one of the great advocates of the humanity of the Indians, gets into a debate that lasts through the middle of the 16th century with Sepulveda and other Spanish theorists over whether the Indians are rational beings, are capable of understanding morality, Christianity, and so on. Sepulveda, who had written the notes to the best Renaissance edition of Aristotle's Politics, claimed the Indians were the people whom Aristotle described as being by nature slaves. And if they're by nature slaves, God bless them, let's enslave them, and set them all to work for the glory of Spain. Sepulveda debates the case. The first professor of philosophy in the New World, close friend of Las Casas, Alonso de la Vera Cruz, in his first lectures on philosophy given in Mexico City, opening the University of Mexico, argues the Spaniards have no right to the territory, they should go home and give it back to the Indians. Naturally, Alonso de la Vera Cruz gets removed, gets sent down to lower Yucatan, goes back to Spain to fight the argument. The argument leads, in theory, to a victory for the humanists of Las Casas and Alonso de la Vera Cruz, when Las Casas gets the Spanish government to underwrite his claim that all people of the world are human, gets the Pope to issue a proclamation saying this in 1537, but he can't get the Spaniards to stop doing what they're doing. By the time the conquest of America is in full swing, racial theories are no longer an idle curiosity, but are now crucial to justifying the treatment of the Indians. And the argument's going on to justify what's happening to the Indians, and then the enslavement of the Africans to replace the Indians whom they're killing off in such great numbers, and because they find the Indians don't make good slaves and the Africans work much better. They start developing various rationales for what's going on. One, and the rationales that get developed are the major theories that dominate the matter for the next 200 years. One, a biblical racism, that the Indians and the blacks are descendants of Ham, have been cursed by God, made the servants of the whites, and so what's going on is what the Bible says should be going on, and the Spaniards are merely doing what God wants done. Another theory which starts turning up shortly after the discovery of America, and which becomes the dominant theory there later on, is that the Indians and the blacks don't come from the biblical world. They're pre-Adamites, and by not being from the biblical world, don't have the capacity of Adamites, and therefore should be the servants of the Adamites, or, of course, the whites. Another sort of theory starts looming is that there is scientific evidence based on comparing the different races, which shows the fact the Europeans want to come out with, that Europeans are by nature better than non-Europeans. You don't need biblical explanations. All you need is anthropological and biological data. And so one finds all sorts of things being claimed in the literature from the mid-16th century into the 18th century about how the Indians are incapable of abstract thought, and stories are told about they're so dumb that when the Indian gets up in the morning, he sells his hammock to the first guy who goes by. Then when the sun starts going down, finds he has no place to sleep. He starts crying, begging for a hammock. And this process goes on day after day, which shows he can't even remember. And for some reason, the California Indians get claimed to be the worst of all, the dumbest of all. And stories are told by various missionaries that the California Indians can't even remember what they're supposed to do as human beings, can't even remember that they're supposed to copulate, and the missionaries have to ring the mission bells to tell the California Indians when it's time to go to bed and to repopulate the world. The African problem begins to take on the same characteristics in the 17th century. Originally, at the time of the discovery of America, there were blacks in Europe at all levels of society, from the top to the bottom. A play like Othello couldn't have been written unless there actually were dark-skinned princes. In the Spanish world and the Portuguese world, one finds there are people in very high government positions who are black. The leader of Cortez's army that conquered Mexico was a black who had led the sack of Rome, and because he was so good at the sack of Rome, he was sent over to America to help conquer the New World. The leader of Coronado's expedition was a black who was sent on the expedition because he's the only one who had ever been in North America before. He'd been with Ponce de Leon. And one finds many cases like this of blacks who are in Portuguese and Spanish universities. Black slavery begins to become an important problem only in the second half of the 16th century. It's actually the great humanist Las Casas who's responsible for it. In his effort to save the Indians, recommends that they try using Africans instead. A few years later, when he sees what happens, becomes a great opponent of African slavery, but it's too late. They've discovered a great business, and the Europeans are off to the races. And having started slavery as one of the greatest businesses, if you read Frank Tannenbaum's book on slavery in America, shows that the Industrial Revolution is built on the proceeds of the slave business, and for every 10 slaves in America, 4 people were employed in England to support the industry, and in towns like Liverpool and Bristol, a third of the population was engaged in the slave trade in one form or another. With it taking on such enormous proportions, then one obviously has to find a justification for it. What sort of justification can one find? And what I discover is one of the oddities, paradoxical oddities of the whole situation, is that every major philosophy from the 16th century to the 19th is universalistic in its theory about the nature of man. And it's claiming that man can be defined solely in terms of psychological or psychic properties, which have nothing to do with anybody's color or religion. But at the same time that all these theories are making this claim, from Montaigne to Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and so on, that the very authors themselves are transforming their theories to justify racism. And from the late 17th century onward, racism becomes a rage among Enlightenment thinkers. Well, why does it happen? One of the leading anti-racists, and one of the few anti-racists of the period, the Abbé Gregoire, offered 4 explanations. One, that they had given up the Bible and its view that everybody was created in the image of God. Another, that they accepted the pre-Adamite theory, that there are men before, that dark-skinned people come from another source than the Adamites who are white. Thirdly, that they had adopted a naturalistic explanation of human behavior in which scientific measurements could justify why some people are better than others, And fourthly, and most importantly, they had an economic interest in defending the state of affairs, the exploitation of America, and slavery and anti-Semitism. If the economic interest is predominant in the theorizing on why blacks are black, and why the Indians are inferior, and why one should have secular anti-Semitism if one's given up traditional anti-Semitism, what sort of explanation can one give? How does one work out a philosophy to justify this? Well, the philosophies that get offered are so numerous. Just sketch one case as an example of what happens, or one indication of what's going on in 18th century theorizing. The prevailing theory of why people are different up to the 18th century is the climate theory. They're living in different climates. But by the 18th century, the climate theory is beginning to break down because blacks have been living in America for 10 generations, Europeans have been living in Africa for 10 generations, the blacks aren't getting any whiter, the whites aren't getting any blacker, so the empirical evidence is beginning to cut into the climate theory, and something else has to be offered as an explanation. Well, what sort of things can be offered as an explanation? One of the major theorists in what happens is the great Scottish philosopher David Hume. Hume, in his essay on national characters, which is written in answer to Montesquieu's climate theory, says the following: I am apt to suspect the Negroes, and in general all the other species of men for their 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufactures amongst them, no arts, no sciences. On the other hand, the most rude and barbarous of the whites, such as the ancient Germans, the present Tartars, has still something eminent about them in their valor, form of government, or some other particular. Such a uniform and constant difference could not happen in so many countries and ages if nature had not made an original distinction betwixt these breeds of men. Not to mention our colonies, there are Negro slaves dispersed all over Europe, of which none ever discovered any symptoms of ingenuity. Though low people without education will start up amongst us and distinguish themselves in every profession. In Jamaica, indeed, they talk of one Negro as a man of parts and learning, but 'tis likely he is admired for very slender accomplishments, like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly. A view like this was obviously the ideal man to get appointed in charge of the colonial office, a job which he received in 1764. Well, Hume's view is not an aberration. It's not just one of it. Everybody knows Hume was anti-Irish, that he didn't like Englishmen, didn't like all sorts of people. It's full of prejudices. But what I'm trying to show in examining this, that Hume's theory grows out of his scientific examination of human nature. He's making the claim that it's based on empirical evidence. He's examined all the civilizations of the world, finds there are none created by non-whites. So, empirical conclusion is there's something called national character, which is fixed. This notion that there's something fixed in all of it appears not only in Hume, but also And the great biologist of the time, Linnaeus is famous for having classified man among the animals, but in his classification of man, the following appears. Under the general category of Homo, then has several categories. First is wild man, four-footed, mute, and hairy. Second is American, the Indians, copper-colored, choleric, erect, hair black, straight, thick, nostrils wide, face harsh, beard scanty, obstinate, content-free, paints himself with red lines, regulated by customs. Then comes the European, fair, sanguine, brawny, hair yellow-brown, flowing, eyes blue, gentle, acute, inventive, covered with clothes, governed by laws. Then the Asiatic, who's sooty, melancholy, rigid, hair black, eyes dark, severe, haughty, covetous, covered with loose garments, governed by opinions. And finally, the African, black, phlegmatic, relaxed, hair black, frizzled, skin silky, nose flat, lips tumid, crafty, indolent, negligent, anoints himself with grease, governed by caprice. All right, if you like that, then turn to the Encyclopedia Britannica, First American Edition. Just take Article Negro, Article Indian is the same sort of thing. Article Negro, after describing some of the location of Negroes in Africa and so on, then says, Negro has round cheeks, high cheekbones, a forehead somewhat elevated, a short, broad, flat nose, thick lips, small ears, ugliness, and irregularity of shape characterize their external appearance. Negro women have the loins greatly depressed and very large buttocks which give the back the shape of a saddle. Vices, the most notorious, seem to be the portion of this unhappy race. Idleness, treachery, revenge, cruelty, impudence, stealing, lying, profanity, debauchery, nastiness, and temperance are said to have extinguished the principles of natural law and to have silenced the reproofs of conscience. They are strangers to every sentiment of compassion and are an awful example of the corruption of man when left to himself. This is the first American edition of the Britannica in the 18th century. I went through the Britannica from issue 1 to the present one. The article on Negro gets worse and worse in their explanation of why the Negro is inferior. The famous 11th edition, which people are still buying to use for their students' term paper, if you read the article Negro, is claiming that what was offered in the 10th edition and 9th edition is the explanation for Negro inferiority, namely that the cranial sutures of Negroes stop growing after puberty, and hence the cranium is condensed, has less brain space, that this is only part of the explanation. Instead, the 11th claims the major factor is that the Negro after puberty is only interested in sex, whereas the white, of course, is interested in making money and everything else, and so is he keeps developing. This explanation, the 11th edition, goes on into the 14th edition, and it's only the 15th edition, which they're now selling, where they've cleaned up the article and started all over again, which indicates they're now trying to sell it to Black Studies courses, which they obviously couldn't have done before. Well, if the sort of material that's being put out by the scientists and the philosophers is making this claim that there's something fixed and basic in the inferiority, what is it that's fixed and basic? What becomes the dominant theory, well, we can say there are two dominant theories fighting each other up to the time of the Civil War. One, that the reason people are different is everybody started off the same. We're all children of Adam. Everybody started off white, and then non-whites are degenerate forms. And the problem for scientific research is to diagnose the disease. What's made people degenerate? And the great degeneration theorists are Count Buffon, the greatest biologist of the 18th century, Blumenbach, who's the official father of anthropology, the great English anthropologist Pritchard, are all trying to figure out, why did whites turn into non-whites? Buffon offers a basic explanation that then gets more and more elaborated on as they get more data. That's a question of climate, food, diet, and culture. And if one, Buffon, who is against slavery, says the situation can be remedied if you could move everybody out of Africa. Actually, the perfect world for them is a belt from the Caucasus Mountains to Paris. Anybody who's living north of it is too white. Anybody who's living south of it is too dark. So the ideal is to get everybody into this belt. So you solve that climate problem, feed them all French food, and give them a French education, and 10 generations or so he envisages you'll have a completely white world. Blumenbach, generation later, is willing to admit the problem may take longer, but something like this is going to solve it. The degeneracy theorists regard the problem of inferior races as soluble by some sort of remedial action. Their opponents are basically using the pre-Adamite theory, in which the world can be divided between the Adamites and the pre-Adamites, and that the distinction between Adamite and pre-Adamite is fixed forever and anon. The pre-Adamite theory, which I've been tracing the history of, only becomes interesting after the discovery of America. And the first form of it, by Paracelsus, offered in 1520, is to claim that the American Indians are descended from a different Adam than the Europeans are. And the American Indians fall in the same category as mermaid nymphs, sirens, salamanders, griffins. And what all these groups have in common is they don't have souls. The racist element in Paracelsus's version is that the pre-Adamites are all trying to get souls by marrying Adamites. And so he regards it as a serious problem of keeping track of who's an Adamite and who's a pre-Adamite. Make sure if you're an Adamite that you keep the pre-Adamites out of the house, away from your daughter. The pre-Adamite theory gets offered by Giordano Bruno, by Sir Walter Raleigh, by Christopher Marlowe, without much of a racist tinge. The full formulation of it is by the man I'm trying to prove is the most important figure in modern intellectual history. Nobody's heard of him. Isaac LaFerrere. Who published a book in 1655 called Men Before Adam. LaFerrere's point is basically non-racist. It's writing a messianic work trying to prove that the Bible only deals with Jewish history, and that Adam is the first Jew and not the first man. There are millions of people before Adam, but the divine history begins with Adam and falls in 3 stages. The election of the Jews from Adam to Jesus, the rejection of the Jews from Jesus to the 17th century, the recall of the Jews that's now going to take place in the 17th century in the Messianic age. The only, and LaFerrere, among his hundreds of heresies, holds the view that everybody's going to be saved in the Messianic age. Pre-Adamites, post-Adamites, Adamites. The only distinction of any racist character that appears in his version is, one, that the Jews are going to get whiter as soon as they're recalled. So darkness is a bad sign. It's part of the sign the Jews have been rejected. And secondly, that when bodies get resurrected in the Messianic age, the Jewish bodies will resurrect better than Gentile ones. But everybody's going to be resurrected. The pre-Adamite theory gets transformed in the 18th and 19th century into 2 basically different versions. One which justifies slavery and the mistreatment of the Indians, the other which justifies modern anti-Semitism. The pre-Adamite theory that's justifying slavery and the exploitation of the Indians gets its great formulation in America before the Civil War. The theory of one of the most eminent American scientists of the period, Dr. Samuel Morton of Philadelphia, and his disciples. Morton wrote a monumental work called Crania Americana in the 1830s, in which he figured out a modern scientific technique for measuring skulls and measuring cranial capacity. She stuffed up all the orifices of the skulls, filled them with pepper seed, weighed the pepper seed, and then came out with tables of figures showing pre-Adamites, namely non-whites, have smaller cranial capacity than whites. Crania Americana does it with the Indians. Then he wrote Crania Egyptica, doing it with Egyptians, blacks, and Jews, in which on a scale, Jews come out with the biggest cranial capacity, then Caucasians in general, then Orientals, then American Indians, at the bottom of the list, Africans. Morton's work gets reinforced by some of his disciples, one of whom is an Egyptologist who studies all the paintings in the Egyptian tombs, finds the blacks haven't changed over the last 4,000 years, the Jews haven't changed over the last 4,000 years, so that racial types are permanent, and that the blacks were slaves in Egypt, so why shouldn't they be slaves now if racial types don't change? Another of his disciples, Josiah Nott, who was a doctor from Mobile, decides to prove the theory by getting the blacks out of the biblical world entirely. Writes a paper on Hebrew philology, in which he's proving the term for blacks in the Bible, the term Cush, which is in the line, the Ethiopian cannot change his skin any more than the leopard, change his color any more than the leopard can change his spots. Nott insists it doesn't say Ethiopian in the sense of black, it means Arab. And it goes through endless Hebrew philology to prove blacks aren't mentioned in the Bible. There are no blacks in the biblical world. The Queen of Sheba was Arabic. Everybody anyone thought was black is really an Arab. And the blacks just aren't in the Bible and have been living outside the biblical world and are pre-Adamites. Dr. Nott gave 2 lectures at Louisiana State in 1848 on biblical and physical history of man, and he wrote to one of his friends. He was lecturing on what he called the science of niggerology. The science of niggerology for him is proving the inferiority of the blacks because they're not Adamites. The final crowning achievement of the disciples of Dr. Morton in developing their pre-Adamite theory is getting their greatest convert, the major biologist before Darwin, Louis Agassiz, on their side. Louis Agassiz, who was a Swiss, and in Switzerland was holding the view that all mankind was one species, but that there are multiple origins of fish, vegetables, plants, animals, and was basing his research on the geographical distribution of animals, fish, and so on, and on fossil remains. Agassiz came to America in the middle of the century, went down to see Dr. Morton's skull collection in Philadelphia, and then had dinner in Philadelphia and encountered his first African as a servant in the restaurant. Immediately he wrote a letter to his mother. He's just amazed they are a different species. They're not part of the same species as we are. And explains all the racial differences, that blacks don't have hair, they have wool, that their physiological structure is totally different. Until this moment, Agassiz had accepted the unity of the human species on the basis of Count Buffon's classification of what constitutes a species. That a species is any group that can copulate together and produce fertile offspring. And all the evidence of the voyages of exploration, since the explorers tried everything, showed that the human species was one species. They produced fertile offspring all over the world. So Agassiz was willing to accept this until he met his first African. Then he rushes from Philadelphia up to Harvard and gave 2 lectures on the pre-Adamite theory, in which he became the greatest scientific advocate of it, in which he is convinced that even though human beings are the only species that are all over the earth that can interbreed and so on, they still break down into 2 separate species, the Adamites and the pre-Adamites. After Agassiz's work on this, the theory gains great respectability until it's overcome by Darwin and a better explanation for racism in terms of the theory of evolution. Agassiz himself wouldn't give up and remained Darwin's greatest scientific opponent because he wasn't going to give up his view of the unchangeability of species, so that the blacks would be, and the Indians would be forever inferior. Well, this sort of pre-Adamism is one justification, as a justification for the inferiority of Indians, Africans, Orientals, and so on. A different kind of pre-Adamism becomes the basis for modern anti-Semitism, a view which develops in Voltaire, in Goethe, and other figures in the early 19th century who go back to La Pereire's view that Adamite means Jewish, is identical with Jewish, and that everybody else is a pre-Adamite, and the pre-Adamites ought to be happy about the situation. The pre-Adamites are better than Adamites, and that the Adamites are the problem. And starting with Voltaire, the aim is to get the Adamites out of Europe. Voltaire is willing to let the Adamites stop being Adamites by becoming philosophers and joining the French Enlightenment, and Goethe is in favor of assimilating the Adamites, but then people theorizing after them, trying to draw a hard and fast line that an Adamite can never become a pre-Adamite. And in the theory which leads to Nazism, that once an Adamite, always an Adamite, it's a spiritual disease you can't get rid of, and the only thing you can do is ultimately the final solution, burn up the Adamites, is the only way of getting them out of the world. Well, if pre-Adamism becomes, in one form, the justification, another form, the justification, the exploitation of the Africans and the Indians, another form, justification for anti-Semitism, is there any alternative to all this? One finds in the time that the theories are being developed as just the beginnings of an anti-racism. Beginnings of it, and just say a few words about the anti-racist possibilities that get raised. One sort of view that's in Las Casas and gets developed in much more flowery form by the Abbe Gregoire. The Abbe Gregoire is an amazing character who starts off his career writing an essay for the Academy of Metz on the question of how to make the Jews happy and useful in France. He writes the prize-winning essay. The solution is to make the Jews citizens in France. When he gets elected to the French Revolutionary Assembly, it's the first bill he introduces, and also introduces a bill to make the clergy civil servants, gets both of these bills passed, then takes on the black question, and writes a book on essay on the moral and intellectual qualities of Negroes, trying to prove that Negroes have the capacity to be civilized, to run a civilization, and in fact goes into 15 case histories of Negroes who write books, who are college professors, who are scientists, and so on, and takes down all the arguments being offered by the racists. Then Gregoire goes on to get slavery abolished in France, get Haiti recognized the Black Republic, and carries on until dies in 1831, fighting for truth and justice everywhere. Gregoire's basic argument is an egalitarianism, that everybody is equally human, and no matter what condition they're in, it's just environmental factors that are making people different. And by joining everybody together in the French Revolution, you'll create a messianic age in which everybody will flourish, and Haiti will be the beacon light into the nations. The Jews will start the real messianic age, and everybody's going to be wonderfully happy. Well, Gregoire's humanistic egalitarianism is one voice crying in the wilderness of the time. Another is that of the great anthropologist, archaeologist, geologist, Alexander von Humboldt, who came to America in 1799 and got involved in the fight with the American racists with Dr. Morton. And when Morton's Crania Americana comes out in these lectures of Knott and so on, von Humboldt finally writes them and says, I really don't care what results you get in your skull measurements. Your theory is desolate and will never get rid of slavery as long as one has this theory. And that no matter what evidence they can produce, von Humboldt says, he's going to insist on the unity of the human species and that no culture is better than another. And makes his great claim that no matter what they show him, he's going to hold a teepee is as good as Notre Dame Cathedral, and that no culture is more noble than any other. By insisting on this complete cultural relativism, von Humboldt offers a possible way out, a possibility as to what one would have to accept to avoid the theories being generated by the various racial theorists in America and Europe. On this quick survey, just try to indicate that racism is a complex of theories about the nature of man, making European man the norm and justifying either the partial or the permanent inferior status of non-whites. The 18th century and the 19th century are the great watershed where these theories get developed. If we're ever going to get out of our racist heritage, I think we need to understand the source of the ideology, principles on which it's based, and what counter-theory one would need of the sort that Gregoire and von Humboldt are trying to develop. I'd like to close by just reading the concluding paragraph from Gregoire's essay on the moral and intellectual qualities of Negroes. After he's argued against every possible justification of slavery, every possible justification of the inferiority of Negroes, he ends saying, may European nations at last expiate their crimes towards Africans. May Africans, raising their humiliated fronts, give spring to all their faculties and rival the whites in talents and virtues only, avenging themselves by benefits and effusions of fraternal kindness, and at last enjoy liberty and happiness. Although these advantages be but the dream of an individual, it is at least consoling to carry to the tomb the conviction that we have done everything in our power to provide them for others. Thank you.
Professor Popkin will respond to questions from the audience. Are there any questions?